Hello. Welcome back to Cocktails and Cliff Notes. I'm your host, Mason, and today we are unearthing the clandestine influence of Freemasonry along with a few other secret societies on America's founding fathers. We're dissecting how these enigmatic brotherhoods shaped early political landscapes and foundational principles. We're revealing the hidden hand behind overt narratives, and exploring the rituals and allegiances that bound these powerful figures. But before we get into all of that, we got to mix up a little drink. We're doing an electrolyte hangover cure. We're going to try to make it pretty, but really, this is what you're going to want to drink after you've had too many cocktails. Let me show you how we're making that. And then once we have our drinks, we can really talk. Take yourself a nice little cup here. I like to use frozen fruit because that means we don't need any ice. So starting with frozen pineapple, and then we're going for a whole bunch of frozen blueberries. Take a little bit of salt and try to get a good salt. I like the Celtic salt, the pink Himalayan salt, something like that. Just dump some of that in. I'm telling you, the right salt can get rid of a headache. We can top this off with some coconut water. I'm going to stir that up and watch your hangover fade away. I promise you. It's perfect. Little salty, little fruity. That's all we need. This will revive you. That'll get you up off the floor. You can probably have a pretty productive day, regardless of the sins you committed the night before. Okay, our story today is going to begin on a bright spring day in 1793. Now, George Washington himself is standing before a crowd in Philadelphia. Now, he walks out and he's dressed not only as the President of the United States, but he's also wearing a Masonic apron. Now, this was not metaphorically, this was not symbolically. Literally, he was wearing this Masonic apron. Now, the apron had apparently been hand embroidered decades before this by Marquise de Lafayette's wife. Now, just for those of you who don't know, Marquise de Lafayette, he was a French military officer and a political figure who actually joined the Continental Army during the Revolution at the time that George Washington was leading it. That's neither here nor there in regards to this story because Washington was wearing this apron while laying the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol. The ceremony itself followed Masonic ritual. There were measured steps, there were formal gestures, there were precise tools displayed for all to see. They weren't hiding this, it wasn't a secret. It raises a question that still flickers like candlelight across history. Why was the most powerful man in the new republic openly performing the rites of a secret brotherhood at the foundation of American government? Now, to modern ears, the phrase secret society tends to trigger wild images of shadow governments, of global cabals, coded messages on dollar bills, etc., etc., and the list goes on. But in the 18th century, secret societies were something very, very different. They were private networks of educated men who gathered behind closed doors to discuss philosophy, to discuss science, morality, politics, power, and the list goes on. And their secrets were not necessarily sinister plots, but they were more rituals and symbols and shared ideals meant to bind members together. In an era of monarchs and censorship and vast political danger, these secret societies actually offered something very radical. They provided a protective space to think freely. to speak freely, and to ponder openly. Now, groups like the Freemasons, the Sons of Liberty, and many, many other philosophical circles functioned less like puppet masters and more like intellectual pressure cookers. They spread Enlightenment ideas very quietly. They built relationships across the colonies and many different class and social lines, and they created loyalties that existed outside of the crown. Now, this brings us to the question beneath the surface of America's founding fathers, much like ink beneath parchment. How much did these networks truly shape the birth of the United States? Were they merely social clubs for elite men, or did they help lay the invisible scaffolding of a revolution? Now, tonight, we're going to try to pull back the curtain as much as we can, and not necessarily in the name of chasing conspiracy, but to explore their influence and the ideas, the quiet connections that helped turn a rebellion into a nation. Because the truth is, some revolutions are not exactly shouted from the rooftops, they're whispered about behind closed doors. By the time the revolution began, Freemasonry was everywhere in colonial America, and it was not everywhere in the sense of dominance or control, but its presence was very well known. Lodges existed in nearly every major city and in every port, including, but not limited to, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, Williamsburg, and the list goes on. Now, they were especially common among men who traveled, who read widely, and moved between the colonies. These were exactly the sort of people who would later become revolutionary leaders. Now, George Washington was a Mason. Ben Franklin was also a Mason who served as Grand Master of Pennsylvania. Paul Revere, also a Mason. John Hancock, also a Mason. And then there were military officers like Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene and many, many others in the Continental Army, high up commanders whose names rarely appear in the textbooks, all Freemasons. Now, this was not a coincidence, but it was also not a secret takeover. Freemasonry in the 18th century was a social and intellectual network that actually crossed many colonial boundaries in a way that very few other institutions actually could. A Mason from Virginia could walk into a lodge in Massachusetts and he'd be welcomed as a brother. And titles, wealth, and social rank were theoretically, and I emphasize theoretically, left at the door. And the only reason I emphasize that is because I know how humans are, but that was the point. What mattered more were shared values and shared trust. And those particular values mattered deeply in a revolutionary age. Now, at the heart of Freemasonry were ideas pulled straight from the Enlightenment. The belief that reason could improve society, the moral virtue mattered more than inherited power, that men were capable of self-governance, and that liberty was a natural right and not a gift from kings. Masonic rituals spoke in allegory, the building of a temple, the refinement of raw stone into something worthy. But the meaning was clear. The world could be reshaped by human hands, guided by ethics rather than crowns. And these ideals aligned perfectly with the growing revolutionary mood. And long before independence was declared, men inside Masonic lodges were already debating questions that would later appear in pamphlets and Congress halls. What gives government legitimacy? Where does authority truly come from? What obligations do rulers owe the ruled? And crucially, and above all, these conversations had to happen in private. Now, these were not secret in a modern sense. It was more of a protection mechanism. Lodges were closed spaces where men could speak freely without fear of British surveillance or loyalist revenge. In an era where a careless word could end a career or worse, that privacy mattered a lot. Now, some lodges became informal centers of great political gravity. Now, the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, which housed St. Andrew's Lodge, is one of the most famous examples. It was at the Green Dragon Tavern where Paul Revere and many other Sons of Liberty met. They drank, debated, and they planned the resistance. And British officers reportedly referred to it as the headquarters of the revolution. Now, while it sounds cool in hindsight, at the time, that particular phrase was uttered likely with a lot more frustration than precision or reverence. Now, in Philadelphia, Masonic lodges were within walking distance of Independence Hall. Franklin himself moved very fluidly between scientific societies, printing shops, political committees, and Masonic meetings, and he carried ideas across every single one of them. Now, the same men who shared ritual oaths on one night might debate independence the very next morning. Now, even within the Continental Army, Masonic ties helped build trust. Officers who barely knew each other could recognize shared values through lodge membership. In a fragile, newly formed army plagued by regional rivalries, that sense of brotherhood mattered a lot. It didn't replace military hierarchy, but it did smooth it out. And yet, it is very important to be clear. Freemasonry did not plan the revolution. It did not issue orders, and it did not dictate strategy. That was something that was done in other rooms with other people. However, what it did provide was infrastructure. It was a ready-made network of trust, communication, and shared ideals at a moment when those things were so desperately needed. The revolution was not born in a lodge, but lodges helped give it language, confidence, connection, and in a world where ideas were as dangerous as weapons, that quiet influence may have mattered more than any whispered command ever could. In fact, Freemasonry was not the only quiet network shaping revolutionary America. And once you actually put a microscope on it and you start looking a little closer, the late 18th century reveals a whole ecosystem of private societies, clubs, and associations operating just beneath the surface of public life. Now, some were formal and some were improvised, some were very short lived. A few were openly controversial, but all of them did seem to reflect a much deeper truth. That truth being that revolution doesn't spread through speeches alone, it spreads through relationships. And one of the most intriguing groups actually formed after the fighting was largely over. The Society of the Cincinnati, founded in 1783 by officers of the Continental Army. Now, at first glance, this particular society seemed a little bit paradoxical because after a revolution fought over the idea of inherited power, here forms a secret society where hereditary membership is passed down from father to son. Now, even George Washington hesitated before accepting leadership, but the society wasn't created to plot or govern. Its goals were very specific and very revealing. Preserve the bonds formed during the war, support widows and orphans of officers, maintain a shared revolutionary identity across state lines, and prevent the army from fragmenting into isolated regional loyalties. Now, its symbolism leaned much more classical than secretive. There was a lot of Roman imagery, there was a lot of civic virtue, there was Cincinnatus, the farmer soldier who relinquished power after saving the republic. And the message was very clear. It was service over ambition. Still, there were a lot of critics who feared it, and Thomas Jefferson actually worried it resembled a new aristocracy. Newspapers buzzed with suspicion, and the reaction alone tells us something very important. Americans were deeply sensitive at this time to networks of influence operating outside formal government. Now, the Society of the Cincinnati was not a conspiracy, but it was a reminder that shared experience, ritual, and loyalty could create powerful bonds beyond legislation. And long before independence even started, there were political clubs with semi private practices that were already shaping the resistance. Now, the Sons of Liberty are the most famous example of this, but even they weren't a single organization. They were a loose constellation of local groups that were often operating under different names, connected by correspondence and shared purpose rather than hierarchy. Meetings were sometimes held in taverns, they were held in back rooms, they were held under deliberately vague titles, membership lists were not written down, and plans were shared face to face. Information traveled through trusted messengers, and this wasn't necessarily paranoia, it was more of a survival thing that they had to implement. Under British rule, open dissent could bring arrest, it could bring financial ruin, or even violence. Secrecy wasn't about domination, it was much more about protection. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, informal political clubs overlapped with merchants' associations, reading societies, fire companies, volunteer militia, and men moved fluidly between them, carrying new ideas. They carried strategy, they carried news, and one conversation in a tavern could echo days later in another colony. One of the main differences between Freemasonry and some of these other secret societies is that Freemasonry was largely philosophical and it was very symbolic at the start. Political action was secondary and it was very indirect. So groups like the Sons of Liberty, they were the extreme opposite of that. They were very immediate, they were tactical, and they were there for a purpose and built for resistance. They used secrecy not for ritual, but for operational security. They were making moves being made in secret because they were actually doing something. And if that got found out, it was going to be thwarted, rooted out, and nothing would have ever come of it. Now, meanwhile, the group of the Cincinnati was very retrospective. They were very preservational. They were concerned with memory, unity, and they were really trying to help get things stabilized after the chaos that came with the revolution itself. They had different goals, they had different methods, but the underlying mechanisms were largely the same. Now, when I say mechanisms, I'm talking about trust-based networks operating beyond official authority. Now, one of the most underappreciated and undervalued role of these secret societies was how they collapsed distance. Communication was extremely slow, the colonies were vast, roads were poor, there was no national government and no unified command, no shared identity at first, but the private networks did seem to fill the gaps. A merchant that was in town traveling for business carried political news, and a mason visiting another lodge carried ideas. A former officer recognized a fellow Cincinnati member across state lines. A pamphlet printed in Philadelphia appeared days later in Boston, and it was discussed by men who already trusted one another. Now, this is how coordination happens before institutions exist. It's not through orders, it's through familiarity, and it's through a shared language. All of this came together through the quiet confidence that someone somewhere else was thinking along the same lines as you and your good buddies meeting at the Green Dragon Tavern. It needed to be shared, and everybody had to make sure they were on the same page. And that was pretty much the service that was provided by these particular institutions. Now, by the time independence was declared, the colonies weren't united because a document said so. They were united because they had already been talking to one another for years. They'd been having these conversations in private rooms, across dinner tables, inside lodges, clubs, taverns, and correspondence circles. The revolution wasn't engineered by a single secret society, it was carried forward by a network culture, one that understood something profoundly modern. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves hand to hand, conversation to conversation, brother to brother, and colony to colony. And by the time the world took notice of this, the groundwork had already been laid. Now, if secret societies helped shape revolutionary America, they did so less through hidden commands and more through symbols. Now, symbols were the shared language of the Enlightenment. And in an age when literacy varied greatly and political speech could be dangerous, imagery carried ideas farther and safer than blunt declarations ever could. Now, let's just take the Great Seal of the United States, shall we? This was approved in 1782, and it features an unfinished pyramid, an all seeing eye, Latin phrases, and a deliberate sense of ancient gravity. Now, I myself have been a bit wary of this imagery because it seems interesting, and to most modern viewers, it still does trigger quite a bit of speculation. But to the 18th century audience, the symbolism was legible and it was even conventional. Now, the unfinished pyramid was supposed to represent a nation still under construction. It was stability without stagnation, strength without tyranny. That's what they say. Now, the eye above it was not a surveillance metaphor, again, allegedly, but a familiar Enlightenment symbol for providence and reason watching over human effort. Okay. It doesn't sound quite as insidious as I think some of our brains can tend to go to. These symbols had appeared frequently in European art, philosophical texts, and yes, of course, Masonic imagery. Now, the Latin phrases mattered quite a bit too. And this is where my Oklahoma accent is going to get me into trouble because I'm not going to say these correctly. But we start with annuit copetus. Copetus? I'm not nailing it. I know that for a fact. I sound like a country bumpkin. I don't care. What this means is that he favors our undertaking. All good and well. Second Latin phrase coming at you now. This is novus ordo seclorum. Oh my God. You're laughing at the way I said it. I'm laughing at myself too. But this means a new order of the ages. Now, this was not a declaration of hidden rule, but a bold statement that history had yet again turned a page. The founders were signaling continuity with classical ideals while declaring independence from a monarchy and inherited authority. Now, these symbols did not create belief, they actually were meant to reflect already established thought processes, and at the same time, symbolic language appeared inside private societies. Now, secret rituals often sound theatrical to very modern ears, but in the 18th century, they served as a practical function. They created trust among strangers. It does sound kind of silly to think about these men doing like a nice bow and maybe like a few steps paced out, whatever they do, whatever the rituals are. And it sounds very sinister. However, it was really used as a way to bond people together who had never met before but knew that everybody was on the same page in that room. There were a lot of men who came from very different colonies, different churches, different economic classes, and rituals offered a neutral ground for them to sit and debate and ponder together as a group, and it stripped away titles and replaced them with a shared experience. Everyone heard the same words and everyone made the same commitments. And the overarching theme that everyone was reminded of was that character mattered more than rank. Once again, this was crucial and mattered tremendously in revolutionary America. The movement brought together merchants and farmers, lawyers and printers, aristocrats and laborers. Now, these are all people who wouldn't naturally trust someone or maybe even associate with each other. Ritualized allegiance offered a shortcut to confidence. This was not meant to be blind loyalty, but mutual accountability. When a Mason called another man brother, or when members of a political club swore discretion, they weren't pledging obedience to a shadow authority. They were agreeing to something simpler and more fragile, and that was to speak honestly and protect one another from exposure. And in an unstable political climate, that promise was priceless. Now, perhaps one of the most powerful functions of this secrecy was not necessarily symbolism or loyalty, but the overarching theme that sparked the revolution and has kept it running. And I would like to believe there are still people out there trying to protect this thought: freedom of speech. That was the whole purpose of meeting in private. Public forums in colonial America were watched very closely. Even the taverns had eyes and ears. Newspapers and things that were printed there had many consequences if they printed the wrong thing. Letters could be intercepted. Radical ideas spoken too loudly could cost a man his business, his liberty, or even his life. Private meetings changed the rules. Behind closed doors, men could ask very dangerous questions. What if Parliament has no authority here at all? What if loyalty to the crown is no longer moral? What if independence is not only possible, but necessary? Now, these were not polite thoughts, they were actually treasonous. They could land a man in a whole world of trouble that he was not prepared for or capable of taking on by himself. By that same token, the colonies were not ready to step forward just yet, but these things had to be deliberated in grave detail. Privacy allowed hesitation, it allowed argument, it allowed disagreement, it allowed for failure, it allowed for evolution, and men could test ideas before releasing them to the world. They could refine their rhetoric and they could refine their strategy and their resolve. This is where moderation and radicalism collided, where compromises were argued into existence, and where unity was forged not unanimously, but by shared risk. Public speeches ignite movement, but private conversations actually make things viable. And it's tempting to imagine these secret societies as engines pulling hidden levers. The reality is much more restrained and much more interesting. They were incubators, they incubated trust. They incubated language. They incubated courage. And by the time the revolutionary ideas reached pamphlets, assemblies, battlefields, they had already been debated, they'd been challenged, and strengthened in private rooms. But this is why these symbols and these rituals actually mattered. Not because they controlled the revolution, but because they gave it a place to grow quietly until it was strong enough to stand in the open, exposed for all to see. When independence finally arrived, it didn't feel sudden, it didn't feel impulsive, it didn't feel unprepared. Not to the men who declared it. They had been living with the idea for many years. They'd been getting their ducks in a row. Now, when the war ended and the shouting faded, the habits formed in private did not simply disappear. Now, the men who built the American Republic had spent years operating inside these networks of trust, discretion, and selective disclosure. They had learned how ideas could be shaped privately before revealing them to the general public. That instinct followed them into a time of peace. You can see it in the architecture of these American institutions. The very Constitution itself had been drafted behind closed doors. Delegates swore secrecy during the Philadelphia Convention. They barred reporters. They locked the windows against the summer heat. And they argued fiercely. They changed their minds and discarded entire plans before they unveiled the finished document to the public. Now, this was not hypocrisy. This was continuity. The founders truly believed that transparency was essential, but they also believed that deliberation required privacy. That tension became baked into the Republic from the very beginning. We still see it today. Committees met in private, caucuses formed, parties emerged quietly before announcing themselves loudly. And even today, much of American politics still operates in the space between public accountability and private negotiation. And the influence of these early societies can also be traced in much less tangible ways. The emphasis on civic virtue, moral character, and self restraint echoes Enlightenment ideals promoted in lodges and clubs. The preference for voluntary associations, civic groups, fraternities, professional societies reflects an inherited belief that democracy is sustained not just by laws, but by relationships outside government. Now, at the same time, Americans have always been very uneasy about hidden power. If you think about it, that has been something that we have been working with as Americans from the birth of the country. Our parents dealt with it, and our parents' parents have dealt with it. From early criticisms of the Society of Cincinnati to 19th century anti-Masonic movements to modern skepticism toward political insiders, lobbying networks, and unelected influence, the fear remains consistent. If power operates out of sight, who truly holds it? This anxiety is not paranoia, it is a feature of Republican thought. I'm not saying Republican like right wing Republican. I'm saying Republican like the republic in which we stand. A self governing people must constantly ask whether loyalty belongs to the public or to private allegiances. Now, the founders themselves wrestled with this question relentlessly. They were men who valued discretion yet feared aristocracy, men who used secrecy yet warned against corruption. And so the debate has never really been settled. Were these societies merely tools of their time necessary in a dangerous political climate, or did they set patterns that continued to shape American power behind the scenes? Did they strengthen democracy, or did they complicate it? And historians still disagree. Some see these networks as scaffolding, which is very useful during construction, removed once the building stood. Others argue that the scaffolding never really came down, it just took a different form. Now, what remains undeniable is this. The American Revolution was not only fought in fields and legislatures, it was argued in private rooms, refined through symbols, and carried out by relationships. And the republic that emerged still bears those fingerprints. Now, whether that legacy is a strength or a warning depends on where you look and who you ask, and how much you believe democracy requires light or shadow to survive. Now, that question, like the nation itself, remains unfinished. And perhaps that's exactly where the story is meant to end, not with certainty, but with curiosity. And I will say, when things are done in secrecy, it leaves gaps that the brain aims to fill. So, when we don't have eyes on a particular situation, we like to fill in the blanks, and it is always much more sinister than reality. The brain and what you can imagine is always going to be worse than what actually happened. So, these questions are always going to remain unanswered. And the more secretive something is, the worse it will be in our heads and minds and hearts. So, that being said, cheers to early government. Got a lot right? Possibly. Got a lot wrong? Possibly.